Xtalks is the industry leader in connecting life science, food, healthcare, and medical device professionals. The Xtalks Life Science Podcast features insightful conversations with industry experts about all things pharma, biotech, and more.
Hello and welcome to the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. I'm Ayesha Rashid, Senior Life Science Journalist at xtalks.com. And this week, I'm delighted to introduce a special guest on our show. As I always say, we're so fortunate to have many special guests. And today we have with us Dr. Arun Swaminathan, who is the CEO of Coya Therapeutics, which is a company developing regulatory T-cell or Treg therapies targeting various diseases in indications spanning neurodegenerative, autoimmune, and metabolic diseases. Dr. Swaminathan has over 20 years of healthcare business executive experience with an emphasis on corporate and business development, strategy, and finance. Dr. Swaminathan began his career in clinical development and commercial roles of increasing responsibility at Bristol Squibb and Covance. Prior to joining Coya Therapeutics, Dr. Swaminathan served as the chief business officer for several companies, including Actinium Pharmaceuticals, where within his first year, he successfully moved forward negotiations to closure and executed a $452 million deal with $35 million up front. So we're talking a lot of big deals and big money here. So really looking forward to the conversation. Dr. Swaminathan, just wanted to also mention, has a PhD in pharmaceutical sciences from the University of Pittsburgh. To hear more about the work that Dr. Swaminathan is now leading at Coya Therapeutics, let's turn to him now. Thank you so much for being on the show, Dr. Swaminathan.
Thank you, Ayesha, and thank you for having me on the show.
I'd like to start off by asking you about, you have an extensive background in business and finance in the pharma and biotech space. And so what has that journey been like, and what led you to take on the role of CEO at Coya Therapeutics?
Yeah, so Ayesha, the journey started maybe 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I co-founded a private company targeting a very different disease space, NASH. And that kind of put that, brought out the entrepreneurial gene to full flow to me. And then what I was able to do is I was able to build on that experience. That's kind of what led to where I am today in Coya. As you mentioned in the introduction, I was the chief business officer of multiple public companies where I was fortunate to be able to execute some significant business development deals that truly brought value to these companies. I joined Coya as the chief business officer as well initially, and then have subsequently, in the last 4.5 months ago, took over as the CEO from our founder and current chairman, Howard Berman. That's been my journey, has been a mix of science and business. What I'm passionate about is really translating good science into commercial opportunities that actually make a difference for patients. So that is what excites me about the CEO role at Coya, and that's what brought me to Coya to begin with. So.
It's wonderful. And we actually did speak with Howard, you mentioned, at Coya. I believe it was sometime last year. He was also with us on the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. So it's so wonderful to have, the leadership from Coya back on and to really learn more about, or to keep learning about the wonderful progress that the company is making in this space. And it's so interesting, and I think it's such an important space and area to talk about in terms of merging science and business. And I think we don't hear too much about it. So really looking forward to your insights on this. And so Dr. Swaminathan, can you tell us a bit about the missions and goals of Coya Therapeutics, first of all?
Absolutely. So, Coya, we are a company currently focused on addressing complex neurodegenerative diseases. So if I had to say, our dream, our vision at Coya is to make some of these diseases like ALS livable diseases where patients can go on with a normal life despite the diagnosis of a devastating disease. That's really our vision, is to do that. Obviously, we would all love to get to curing these diseases, but I think the first step is to make these diseases manageable. We sometimes use the example of something like, HIV, very different diseases. But 20 years ago, HIV was a death sentence, essentially. Today, patients are not cured of HIV, but they can pretty much lead a full and normal life with the right therapies on board. That is kind of the dream we have at Coya, is to make diseases like ALS, frontotemporal dementia, livable diseases where with the right therapies, people can lead a completely normal life. And if we even come anywhere close to achieving it and play a small part in this, I think we will all feel fulfilled at Coya. So.
Indeed. And so in terms of Coya's approach to really making these kinds of diseases manageable, in terms of probably, as you mentioned, HIV or even other chronic conditions like diabetes, maybe it could be something like that one day. And so what is Coya's approach? It's a very innovative approach, regulatory T-cell therapy based. And so could you tell us a bit more about that?
So our central approach is addressing these cells called the regulatory T cells. What we do know is that when these regulatory T cells are dysfunctional, they drive the progression of neurodegenerative diseases. For example, if you take ALS patients, there's a direct correlation between Treg dysfunction and the progress of these diseases. So as I said, our vision right now is to stop the progression of these diseases. And we believe that the way to stop the progression of these diseases is by making these Tregs functional. By doing that, we bring down neuroinflammation, and that is the underlying trigger for the progression of all these diseases. If I could take maybe a step up, most people know what white blood cells are. And within the white blood cells are these things called T cells, right? Everybody knows T cells get mobilized when they see foreign things that they believe shouldn't be there. And they're one of our defense mechanisms. And there are cells called the helper T cells, which kind of help T cells do this job more efficiently. Regulatory T cells, as the name implies, regulate or modulate and make sure that these T cells don't go out of control. So there are these things called effector T cells and so on, that you don't get the cells starting to kill these cells starting to kill their own systems, which is what happens in both neurodegenerative diseases and autoimmune diseases. So that's why we believe fundamentally addressing this dysfunction can really stop the progress of multiple diseases.
Indeed. And so really targeting inflammation through Treg, through making Tregs functional, how does that approach differ from, let's say, other companies or other scientists and other researchers, there's other developers in the field. And this is a form of immunotherapy in essence. And so what really differentiates and sets this approach apart from others?
Yeah, I mean, to my knowledge, I think we're the only company that's Treg focused and taking a biologic approach to it. There are many companies pursuing different neurodegenerative diseases. If you take ALS as an example, I think a lot of companies are pursuing different mechanisms in ALS. Unfortunately, ALS has had a pretty high clinical trial failure rate. And partly we believe this is because ALS is a heterogeneous disease. And while some of these targets may work for some patients, I think they don't work across the ALS patient types. And the way the trials are designed, I think it has set some of these candidates not to show success because they don't work across this heterogeneous population in ALS. That is one of the areas where we are differentiated, I believe, because Treg dysfunction is kind of universal across ALS patients, regardless of genotype, regardless of whether they're sporadic or they're driven by C9orf mutations or SOD1 mutations. What you do see in ALS patients is that Treg dysfunction is high. And Treg dysfunction, as I mentioned before, drives all the progression of the disease. So that's one area we're differentiated in, is that Coya 302, our lead product that we are targeting for ALS, does that well. We manage Treg dysfunction well. And what differentiates us further is we do that through a combination approach. What we have found is that in this field, one size is not going to work for all, that you have to address these complex diseases through hitting multiple, in our case, immune pathways. And so we kind of make it work. And I think what we've seen is that we're seeing very encouraging results that give us a lot of hope that our bigger trial in ALS will be positive, and that our trials in frontotemporal dementia, as well as our combination approaches in Alzheimer's disease, will all lead to positive outcomes.
And what would you say are some of the biggest challenges in developing these therapies?
Well, I think biotech is a tough space, as anybody following biotech will know. We do have to go through a very systematic process to get these products to the market, and designing the right trial, selecting the right biomarkers, making sure you have the right patient population, making sure you have the right screening criteria, so inclusion and exclusion criteria are done in a thoughtful manner. I think all of these are important in terms of outcomes and success, because you could have a wonderfully scientifically valuable product, but sometimes doing the wrong design, the wrong studies, studying it in the wrong patients can kind of lead down a path that takes years then to fix and undo. So what we're trying to do well at Coya is really learn from what others are doing and try to optimize our path forward. So we try to take out some of those uncertainties. Clinical trials intrinsically there's a degree of uncertainty built in, but we feel good based on the science. What we've been good at Coya is we follow the science, and the science is telling us our approach to Treg dysfunction makes a difference. And so, we've kind of put our stake on it, and we're starting to see positive value creation out of it. So.
And we know about, the significant unmet needs in diseases like ALS, Alzheimer's, but what do you think are have been the biggest gaps scientifically, and also perhaps on the commercial end, to really merge the two and get those therapies out? I know we've seen some therapies hit the market, but then run into scrutiny in terms of really the clinical benefit not being quite there. And so how do you really address the gaps that are there right now scientifically, and how do you ensure that they will be translated into clinical and commercial success?
Yeah, I mean, neuroscience and neurodegenerative field is right now kind of where oncology was 15 years ago, right? The success rate has been low. I mean, that was where oncology used to be, and things are changing. Same thing will happen in this space. I do believe neuroscience is the next frontier in biotech, where we're going to start seeing some amazing advances coming from multiple companies, coming from academia in the next decade. And Coya, we hope to be part of that. We hope to be one of those companies that is contributing to the success in this field. ALS is a disease that has very few options, Ayesha. I mean, there's two drugs that are currently on the market, Radicava and Riluzole, both old drugs that don't completely stop the progression of ALS. Patients continue to decline. The average patient survives about 3 years after diagnosis of ALS, despite these drugs on the market. And as you mentioned, another drug was approved and has been subsequently withdrawn from the market because it didn't show the efficacy in the phase 3 trial. What we are doing at Coya is, again, going back to my previous statement, we're taking a very systematic scientific approach. Number one, I think the key is we know how we work. which seems obvious to state, but a lot of drugs in this field actually can't tell you how they actually work. Having that clarity in our mechanism of action allows us to then really wrap our clinical trial program and choose our indications in a scientific manner that maximizes the probability of technical and regulatory success. Right? Nothing guarantees success, but I think what our approach does is it is de-risked at every step. So we keep increasing our probability that we'll be successful kind of at every step, including the targets we have chosen. What is creative about what Coya does is that while we're taking an innovative approach, our approach is not esoteric either. Now, esoteric ideas are needed because that's how sometimes advances happen, but esoteric ideas also have a very high failure rate. Our ideas are grounded in known mechanisms, low-dose interleukin-2, which we use to increase Treg numbers and function, in itself has existed. IL-2 in different forms have existed. But we are applying the science in a very different area in neurodegenerative diseases, where IL-2 high doses were typically applied in oncology, right? So we're taking that. So there's a lot of wealth of safety and clinical data that we can build on that gives us confidence in the safety, for example, of our combinations. CTLA-4, another target that is extremely well validated, has been treated in millions and millions of patients in a safe and efficacious manner. Again, we're applying this combination to diseases like ALS, FTD, Alzheimer's, but the targets themselves are pretty well validated. So we're taking a kind of a nice approach, a balanced approach of innovation while de-risking. And then we're letting the science and data drive our choice of indications. So we feel like that's what we're doing well and hopefully different from others. That gives us a lot of confidence in the outcomes of our trials. Now, having said that, one can never guarantee the outcomes of these types of trials, right? So, but we feel like we're doing all the right things to minimize any uncertainties to the extent we can. We're controlling what we can, essentially. So.
Which is extremely important. And on the topic of clinical trials, in terms of you did mention this, that really selecting the right patients and the right biomarkers and all of that is so critical. And so what really goes into those decisions? And also in terms of, patient-centric trials, we hear about this all the time, but what does that really mean? And how does Coya approach that model?
Yeah, so for example, with ALS, since that's our lead program and we're getting ready to begin a potentially registrational phase 2b study there later this year, it's a couple of things. One, we looked at the proof of concept data we ourselves generated through an investigator-initiated trial. What does the data say? What do the biomarkers say? We saw, for example, oxidative stress markers get dramatically decreased on treatment. Things like NFL, things like 4-hydroxynonenal, oxidative LDL. So we are looking at all of those things as parameters for potentially screening patients, potentially also making sure that some of those inflammatory marker levels are uniform between the placebo group and the treatment group, because a lot of those types of things. And we haven't publicly disclosed the details of our protocol yet, but I'll keep it at a high level and say we are looking at stratifying by biomarkers, for example, because I think that'll help us enrich the patient population, and that we're choosing the patients that are likely to benefit the most from our therapy. We're also going to have cutoffs on things like ALSFRS score. That's the score that tells you what stage an ALS patient's at. So we're going to choose these mild to moderate patients. 35 kind of is that score we're looking at to make sure that patients are not too far progressed when they enter our trial, because sometimes it may be hard to make a difference in patients like that in a meaningful way, but also that they're not just in their day one of ALS either. So, we're kind of making sure that we have the right group of patients. We also want to make sure that these patients coming into the trial are declining at the kind of expected rate. For example, the PROACT database, which is a huge database from Massachusetts General and Harvard, shows that the average patient declines about 1 point a month on the score called ALSFRS. So ideally, what we want in our trial is patients who are more or less declining at that rate before they came into the trial. Because if we have patients who don't, for some reason, decline at all, and there's a few patients, then it is hard to show a statistical separation in those patients. Or the opposite, if there's a patient declining at 3 points a month, that we may not have enough time for the drug to actually get there and start doing what it needs to do to stop before this patient declines so much. So a lot of this is going into our protocol. And we align with the FDA on all of these aspects. So that's, I think, what we're doing with everything we have learned, is making sure, I said this before, we reduce the uncertainties, reduce the variabilities as much as we can. Now, we can't completely remove all of those, right? So.
And in terms of patient advocacy, that's been a really important area, especially for ALS. And so how is that landscape now in terms of how does Coya potentially engage with patient advocacy groups, and what learnings and what inputs do you take from those groups into the work that you do?
Extremely important. I mean, we are a very patient-centric company. We never forget that at the end of it, this is about the patient, right? If we do what's right for the patient, everything else will follow. I mean, financial success, shareholder value, we always keep that at the core of what we do in Coya. And to your point, we're very actively engaged with the patient community. We have people in Coya personally affected by these diseases like ALS and FTD. One of them publicly speaks about it, so I'm not sharing anything that is confidential. For a small company our size, it is also unusual to have a person dedicated to patient advocacy, and we have a VP dedicated to patient advocacy, where we engage with patients. Obviously, there's rules and regulations from the FDA on what we can and can't do with patients. So we make sure that we don't cross any lines there. But we are actively listening to patients, their problems, their journeys. We're part of support networks and groups for these patients. We're active in social media with the patients. So yeah, absolutely. And these patients are highly engaged, where their input through opinion leaders is also important and drives how we do the trials. So this is unlike some diseases where patients are not as engaged. ALS and FTD patients and their families are highly engaged in this cause, and that's central to our core value at Coya.
So wonderful to hear and learn about, indeed. And in terms of sort of the advancements in the field that you've seen up until now, you did mention that you believe that the neuroscience space is evolving in the way that oncology evolved, and that we'll pretty soon perhaps see the advancements that we've seen in oncology in terms of personalized medicine really breaking through, and seeing that in neuroscience and neurodegenerative diseases as well. And so what specific, I guess, advancements and innovations do you see really driving that?
I think if I use oncology as an analogy, oncology, I'm oversimplifying here, moved from chemotherapy to immunotherapy. And when they moved to immunotherapy, kind of transformational options started coming in, right? The PD-1s and so on, CTLA-4 the other way as well. So I think in neuroscience, people are starting to recognize immune systems play a pretty significant role in neurodegenerative diseases as well. And that targeting at the fundamental level, the immune system is where I believe the breakthroughs are going to come, transformational breakthroughs are going to come in neurodegenerative diseases. Now, neuropsychiatry is not my field, but I think it's a little bit different there. But definitely in neurodegenerative diseases, I think that is the cutting edge of science, and we're going to start seeing more things coming. And I'm proud to say that Coya is one of the strong believers in that space, and we're moving forward. And also, I believe, just like oncology, it's going to be about combinations, Ayesha, because just like oncology, one target hitting one thing may not be enough. You got to hit it in multiple ways. So the same thing is, I think, going to happen in neuroscience as well. So.
Yeah, and in terms of in oncology, resistance is a huge aspect to consider, and I imagine that in neurodegenerative diseases, that's also an important consideration. So those combination therapies definitely help address those.
Yeah, I think more than, I don't know if resistance is real in neurodegenerative diseases, but inflammation is real. And I think addressing inflammation is going to be the key that unlocks great potential in neurodegenerative diseases. And I don't think, I'm not saying that because Coya is focused on that. Of course we are.
No bias.
But I think the science is moving that way. If you listen to a lot of experts, 10 years ago, people did not really acknowledge that neuroinflammation is a driver of progression of these diseases. Today, I think most people will say, of course, right? So, that's kind of, I think, a central theme as well.
Yeah, and really understanding the biology, right? Understanding the pathogenesis of these diseases is so, so important. And I think maybe it's not emphasized enough, and then that's how you're able to target those mechanisms once you understand them. So that's super important. And in terms of, with your extensive, prolific background in business, finance, commercialization, what can you tell us about the current landscape in bringing therapies to market, specifically in neurodegenerative diseases like ALS? And how do you really, I guess this might be like an elementary question, but really, how do you choose what candidates to move forward? And those decisions are so critical and so important. And how do you go about, what is that pathway from development through to commercialization?
Yeah, in our case, we have chosen Coya 302 as the candidate to move forward in ALS. As I mentioned before, we should be starting our phase 2b trial later this year. The process is what is typical of any drug development process. You first make sure it works in preclinical models, make sure the science makes sense, do small proof of concept studies, and then move to bigger studies. So we're not doing anything that different process-wise. We're doing it more efficiently and faster by being pretty creative in how we have quickly generated some of this data. And in a disease like ALS, the regulatory flexibility is there as well. Regulators want to see drugs approved in the space as much as we all do because, the unmet need is high. So on the commercial side, we did partner with Dr. Reddy's as our strategic partner to help us commercialize in ALS. ALS is there's a pretty high unmet need, as I mentioned before. So there's a pretty good commercial opportunity in ALS as well. The last product that launched, Relivrio, which was subsequently withdrawn, if you look at the public reporting data, I believe they made about $500–600 million in sales in the first year of their launch. So it's a pretty significant commercial opportunity, and we look forward to working with our partners, Dr. Reddy's, to bring the product to the market at the appropriate time. Obviously, we have to go through a few steps in between before we get to the market. ALS affects about there's 6,000 new patients diagnosed with ALS every year in the United States, about 30,000 patients on any given day. So it's a pretty concentrated market. So from a commercialization perspective, you don't need a major sales force. You don't need to spend like an insane amount of money to commercialize such products. And the reimbursement landscape is generally good because of the high unmet need of these diseases. And so all of that lines up well. But our focus right now at Coya is obviously getting to that next stage, which is get the FDA green light for us to move into the bigger clinical trial, and then the data will drive all subsequent decisions, right? So.
And you mentioned the partnership with Dr. Reddy, and so how important are those collaborations and partnerships in a space like this and for a company like Coya?
Extremely important. I mean, having a partner like Dr. Reddy's allows us to focus on what we do well, while they can focus on what they do well. We are a company that is geared to bring these kinds of new therapies to the next stage, go back to the bench, look at what works, what doesn't work, and advance new targets, new indications, identify new indications. That is what we are good at doing. We are not a company set up to become a big commercial machine, commercialize this. I'm a strong believer that business development deals are all about creating that synergy. You take two people or two parties that bring different things to the table. Dr. Reddy's has exceptional experience in manufacturing. We can spend the next 10 years hiring people and we'll never have the expertise Dr. Reddy's has in terms of biologic manufacturing. So we fully leverage their expertise in those things. They have a sales force. They have a US commercial footprint. They have a European commercial footprint. Could Coya build all that? Sure. But is it more efficient and effective to partner with somebody who has it? Yes. So I'm a strong advocate of business development deals as a way not just to support the smaller companies like us financially, but as a way to bring products most efficiently to patients, which is the ultimate reason we're all in business, is how do we bring products to patients that actually matter? And I think partnering with the right people is the way you can accelerate some of that. So, outside of the other benefits that come to small companies like Coya, of course, we have gotten non-dilutive money from partnerships like this. This allows us to be pretty efficient in our capital market strategy. So there's a lot of other positives, but I think the biggest positive is two heads together with different skill sets or not overlapping skill sets at least really helps in bringing these products faster to the market, hopefully. Regulatory strategy, two brains are better than one. I can go on.
Absolutely.
And as you can tell, our partnership is going wonderfully well, which is why I'm pretty excited about this. And right. we're thrilled to have them as our partner. And it's been a great year and 2 months or 3 months of our partnership.
That's so great to hear. And we hope that partnership moves forward as fruitfully as it has been so far. And in terms of, upcoming milestones, I know you mentioned that you will be enrolling for the phase 2B trial soon. And so what can we expect in the next couple of months and couple of years? And what are you most looking forward to in terms of building Coya and moving therapies forward?
Ayesha, we have exciting 2025, 2026. It's filled with milestones. Starting with, we didn't talk about this asset, but we have Coya 303, which is a combination of low-dose interleukin-2, our proprietary one, Coya 301, with a GLP-1 agonist, targeting not just neurodegenerative, but other diseases as well. This has immense value-creating potential for Coya because the GLP-1 market is big, and we have intellectual property where the combination of our Coya 301 with the GLP-1 is ours. And we have shown, and we hope to publish that data soon, showing synergy between these two in neurodegenerative models. So milestone-wise, you can expect a publication in the upcoming months on that. I think that's going to generate a lot of interest, including from potential pharmaceutical partners, because this is a big space with a lot of potential. Second, we had earlier reported some investigator-initiated data in mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease with our low-dose interleukin-2. You'll see some follow-up data coming from us in the upcoming months with single-cell proteomics, essentially data that hopefully will further validate that what we're doing is fundamentally changing inflammation at the cellular level. It sounds a little geeky. Why does it matter is sometimes the question I get, but I think you get it. Why? Because it kind of validates everything we're doing. It shows us that we are doing what we said we will mechanistically, and understanding that mechanism gives us a lot of confidence in the clinical outcomes. And also it shows people that the clinical outcome we saw where we stopped cognitive decline with the once-a-month dosing is real, because there can be a placebo effect at the cellular level. There can be placebo effects at the cytokine level. And so that's data that's going to be pretty exciting for people, which just further strengthens our story. In addition to that, we anticipate sharing top-line data from an investigator-initiated trial in patients with frontotemporal dementia using the low-dose IL-2 CTLA-4 combination. That should be coming in hopefully the early second half of this year, if not earlier. So we're pretty excited about that, because that data, if it's positive, just keeps building on our probability of success, essentially, right? For not just for FTD, but for ALS, for Alzheimer's, and so on. We will file the IND with the FDA, and once we get the green light, start the trial, as you mentioned. The IND approval and the trial also triggers 8.4 million payment from our partner, Dr. Reddy's, to us, a milestone payment that is non-dilutive. So again, it'll help us continue to strengthen our cash runway and cash balance as well in a non-dilutive manner, which is great for the company and for our shareholders as well. So those are just some of the milestones coming just this year. And then when we get into next year, there's going to be a lot of big readouts, including the ALS readout. So it's a pretty exciting time to be part of Coya. We got something happening almost on a weekly basis that is exciting. So,
and that is so exciting for us to hear. In terms of at Xtalks here, we're always covering the latest innovations and really the cutting edge companies, biotech companies in this space. And so, we're so fortunate and so happy to be able to profile companies like Coya and to speak to leaders like yourself, Dr. Swaminathan, in the field. So we thank you so much for your time, and we thank you especially for all of the work that you're leading in this space. And we look forward to keeping up to date and all of the milestones that will be coming up.
Thank you, Ayesha. Thanks for the opportunity to be on your show. I really appreciate it, and happy to come back anytime.
Absolutely. Thank you. The pleasure was mine. The pleasure was ours here at Xtalks. And that's it for this episode of the Xtalks Life Science Podcast. If you liked today's show, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. Thank you, everyone, and we will see you next week. Bye for now.
To join the Xtalks community, visit xtalks.com and register for exclusive access to curated content like live webinars, news articles, and educational videos. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the speakers sharing them and should not be taken as professional advice, nor do they necessarily reflect the policy or position of Honeycomb Worldwide. For further information, email us at podcast@xtalks.com.